Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, we would love you to. And you can do so at patreon.com/the History Network. Thanks to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 35, Episode 9. The Roman Empire's Darkest Day. Disaster at the Battle of Adrianople, 9th of August, AD 378, Part 2. This episode was written by Murray Darm. Murray is an ancient and medieval military historian from New Zealand living in Australia. He has written more than 100 articles on various aspects of ancient and medieval military history, as well as other historical topics from all periods, ranging from the history of opera to the runic alphabet and recipients of the Victoria Cross. He is the author of Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior, Athenian Hoplite versus Spartan Hoplite, and Leuctra 371 BC, all from Osprey Publishing. He is, of course, a regular writer on here and a regular on the Ancient Warfare podcast. The marching Romans soon came upon the Gothic wagon laager. Scouts reported that it was perfectly circular, literally turned by a lathe, and probably sited on a hill as earlier wagon laagers of the previous 2 years had been. The Goths at the wagons uttered a fierce and hideous yell, and the Roman officers began to marshal their line. Ammianus then offers us a detail that is important for interpreting the events of the battle. The right wing of the Roman cavalry was placed in front of the greater part of the infantry behind. Ammianus uses the term subsidebat, a term usually interpreted as in reserve, although it could mean in support. The cavalry of the Roman left wing was, however, absent. They were still travelling to the battlefield while the army was deploying. Other surviving sources offer help here. Sozomen tells us that Valens decided to attack before his men were in the proper order, while Socrates states that the Roman cavalry revolted and refused to engage. Whether this was the cavalry of the right wing or the left wing is unclear, but it was probably the cavalry who did not make it onto the battlefield. Perhaps their commander had recommended waiting for Gratian. Zosimus briefly summarizes the battle. Valens led his whole army against the Goths in complete disarray. The barbarians met them without hesitation and won an easy victory, almost totally annihilating the Romans. Ammianus goes into more detail, telling us that the barbarians were terrified by the clashing of Roman weapons and shields. Some of the Goths must therefore have been drawn up in front of their laager, perhaps the 10,000 seen earlier. According to Ammianus, this terror was because part of the Gothic forces, namely the cavalry under Alathius and Saphrax, was far away, and, though sent for, had not yet arrived. This may, however, have been what Fritigern and the Goths wanted the Romans to think. When the Gothic cavalry did return, they returned en masse, and at the exact moment, to deliver a decisive massed cavalry charge. It is clear that the Romans had no idea where the Gothic cavalry actually were, and it seems more likely that the Gothic cavalry were secretly getting into position to deliver just such a charge, and that Fritigern was playing for time. The terror of his men was exactly what Fritigern had told Valens their reaction would be, were the emperor to appear with a Roman army to bring them back into line. At this point, more Gothic envoys were sent to the Romans to take up yet more time. Most modern reconstructions of the battle describe the Gothic cavalry as away foraging. This is never stated in the sources. If so, they would not have been in a single body, but they still managed to return organized and deliver a decisive single mass charge at precisely the right moment as the battle unfolded. Modern reconstructions also accept that the Goths were actually terrified, even though those same Goths had defeated successive Roman armies over the previous 2 years, Roman armies commanded by the same men who came against them again now. What is more, they probably still outnumbered the Roman forces brought against them, although their true numbers seem to have been concealed from the Romans at this point. Actual terror of the Romans on the part of the Goths seems highly unlikely, and was more likely subterfuge. If a small part of the Goths was drawn up outside the Lager, the 10,000, these troops may have played their part in enticing the Romans to attack uphill by their feigned terror, and their small numbers made the Romans confident of success. The Romans may have even believed that they outnumbered the Goths. They would soon be disabused of such a belief. The idea of Fritigern playing for time is reinforced by his next action, sending more envoys suing for peace. The first envoys sent were of low birth, however, and they were rejected by Valens, who demanded that higher-ranking men be sent. Ammianus recognizes that these envoys were indeed playing for time to allow the cavalry to return, but he seems oblivious to the idea that they were biding their time to strike. More likely is that they were getting into a position behind and above the Gothic Lager, a position that the Romans could not have reconnoitred. Ammianus includes a detail in his account of Adrianople which modern reconstructions have not made much of at all, namely that, in addition to the heat of an early August day, which parched the Romans' throats, they were also suffering from the smoke generated by fires burning on the plain, fires deliberately lit by the Goths. Ammianus's explanation is that these fires were lit in order to exacerbate the thirst of the Romans, but such fires would have affected the Goths just as much, and being higher up the hill, perhaps more so. These fires may instead have been a signal to the Gothic cavalry to return, or perhaps a signal for them to make their charge, possibly combined with the idea that the smoke could conceal their course. Ammianus tells us earlier of Gothic signalling systems which could easily have been by fire signal. Crafty Fritigern then sent a common soldier to request that the Romans send the Goths men of noble rank as hostages, and that he would withstand the anger of his men. The precise meaning of Ammianus's phrase is unclear, but seems to relate to the idea of Fritigern negotiating or declaring peace. This too was a ploy, however, playing for yet more time. Argument among the Romans over who should go took yet more time still, until Rycomeres volunteered to represent the Romans, and he began to make his way to the Gothic Lager. As he did, however, units on the Roman right, called the Sagittarii and the Scutarii, and led by Cassio and Bacarius of Iberia in Armenia, respectively rushed forward and engaged the enemy. In most modern interpretations of the battle, these Sagittarii and Scutarii have been viewed as infantry units, literally archers, Sagittarii, and shieldmen, Scutarii, but they seem to have actually been cavalry units, a position first argued by Simon McDowell in 2001 and followed more recently by Peter Donnelly in 2013 and Adrian Coombs-Hoare in 2015. These units can be identified with cavalry units mentioned in the Notitia Dignitatum and were perhaps units of the Scolae cavalry, being the Schola Scutarorium Prima, Schola Scutarorium Secunda, and Schola Scutarorium Sagittarium. These were probably the cavalry units deployed on the right ahead of the infantry. They became engaged with the Gothic left wing, perhaps provoked into doing so by the Goths. The cavalry attacked rashly, but were put to flight. This too may have been part of Fritigern's plan, since the next action of the Goths was the decisive one in the battle. The retreat of the Roman cavalry on the right was followed immediately by the charge of the Gothic cavalry under Alathius and Saphrax, combined with a group of Helani. Ammianus's turn of phrase makes it clear that the appearance of the Gothic cavalry was a shock to the Romans and completely unexpected. They appeared like a thunderbolt from the mountains, spreading slaughter among all they came across. This also seems to imply that they charged from higher ground. If the Roman units were indeed cavalry withdrawing or retreating already, then the charge of the Gothic cavalry would most assuredly have been into them to take advantage of their setback. Most modern reconstructions of the battle have, however, shown the Gothic cavalry charging into the Roman left, where there was no cavalry, but the charge of the Gothic cavalry into the retreating and disordered Roman cavalry on the right makes the most sense. For the Gothic cavalry to deliver such a decisive charge at precisely the right moment, they needed to have got into the ideal position. The envoys, signal fires, and the deliberately provoked skirmishing on the Roman right wing all seem to suggest that this was part of Fritigern's plan all along, tricking the overconfident Romans into an engagement where he could deliver a decisive blow. Combined with his request the day before that Valens approach the Goths and show himself at the head of an armed host, these all seem to paint a very different picture of the battle than the one usually presented. The total defeat of the Roman cavalry on the right meant that Valens's force were left without any cavalry on the field at all. The historian Orosius tells us that the Roman cavalry were thrown into confusion and they left the companies of infantrymen without protection. The Gothic cavalry then surrounded the Roman legions on all sides and overwhelmed them with clouds of arrows. The Chronicon, or Chronicle of Jerome, written in 380, and therefore the earliest source for the battle, also tells us that the Romans lacked the protection of cavalry and were surrounded and slaughtered. Sozomen too tells us that the Roman cavalry were dispersed. The battle was not over, however, as the Roman infantry were still intact, albeit now surrounded by unchallenged Gothic cavalry. The Roman infantry now rallied and advanced their left wing, advancing all the way to the Gothic laager. Unprotected by cavalry and surrounded by Gothic cavalry, however, the Roman infantry crowded together so that soldiers could barely draw their swords. The Goths sent in wave after wave of missiles, which were bearing death on every side, according to Ammianus. At that moment the Goths rushed against the Romans. This description seems to suggest a new wave of Goths, perhaps reinforcements hidden inside the wagon laager and unseen by the Romans until now. This too would add to the idea that the battle was a Gothic stratagem, perhaps even a series of them. This new surge of Goths left no room for retreat for the Roman infantry, who, surrounded, now fought to the last. The ground was soon slippery with blood, but the sun was just reaching its zenith, and the Romans fought on, hungry, thirsty, and exhausted by the weight of their armour. Finally the Roman line was broken, and those Romans who were left fled as best they could over unknown paths. Valens himself was in the middle of the action according to Ammianus, although some sources say he wasn't even on the battlefield. This depends on the source and its attitude towards Valens. Those who accuse Valens of cowardice Our Nicene Christian sources and their biases against him arise because he opposed their faith just as they opposed his. Valens, abandoned by his armigieri, bodyguards, took refuge with two units, the Lanciarii and the Natiarii. The exact identity of these units is unclear, but they were infantry units. Valens was then wounded by an arrow just as night was coming on, but having fought amid the common soldiers, and having discarded his royal cloak, his body could not be identified. This was only one of a plethora of stories of Valens's demise. Even Ammianus provides two. The second version has the wounded Valens taken to a fortified cottage. Surrounded by the enemy, the occupants defended themselves, but the Goths piled wood and straw around the house and burnt it and anyone in it, including the emperor, a man who jumped from an upstairs window as Ammianus's source for this story. Many Nicene authors use the imagery of Valens's fiery demise to paint a picture of divine retribution for his heretical Arian faith. The death of the Arian Valens irrevocably altered the direction and history of the Christian Church. Thereafter, Nicene Christianity was the dominant force for more than a millennium. Only a moonless night saved the Romans from greater losses, suggesting long hours of combat, but her emperor was dead, together with many of her senior commanders and most of the troops of the east. Rome had not known such disaster for centuries. Other than the emperor, Rome lost several of its most prominent commanders, Trajanus and Sebastianus, both magistri militum, former magister militum, Equitius Valerianus, in charge of the royal stables, and Potentius, tribune of the select promoti troops, as well as 35 tribunes. All of these losses suggest that the Roman army was indeed sizable, and barely 1/3 of it survived. Ammianus concludes his entire Res Gestae 31-13-19, stating that Rome had not suffered such a massacre since Cannae in 216 BC, where she may have lost 80,000 men. The impact of the Roman defeat was massive and would be felt until the Western Roman Empire fell in the following century, if indeed it was not one of its leading causes. Well, thank you once again, Murray, for writing that amazing two-parter for us. If you'd like to have a go at writing an episode for us, or you want to contact us and give us an idea for a subject that you think we've not covered yet, then just drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org for that. And once again, please do consider becoming a patron of the podcast at patreon.com/thehistorynetwork. Once again, thank you to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Dahm, read by Nick Barker.